Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Much Work to Do, the Top 5 Great Lakes Federal Policy Priorities. I'm Jennifer Caddick, Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President of Communications and Engagement, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to run through really quickly. We are excited to have over 400 people registered for this webinar conversation. Thank you so much to all of you for taking time today to join us. To limit background noise, all participant lines will be muted for the duration of this conversation. However, we're excited to hear your questions, and to ask a question, you can use the question box, as you can see on the screen here, to enter your question at any time. We'll leave plenty of time at the end of the conversation to get to your questions, and so we're excited to hear from you. Today's webinar is being recorded, and later this afternoon, you will receive a follow-up email from us with links to any resources that we talk about during the conversation, as well as a recording of this conversation. I'm excited to be joined by a fantastic panel today, and they include Joel Brammeier, Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO, and he's talking to us from Chicago today. Hello, Joel. Molly Flanagan, Alliance for the Great Lakes Chief Operating Officer and Vice President for Programs. She's also joining us from Chicago. Welcome, Molly.
Thanks, Jen.
Crystal Davis, the Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President for Policy and Strategic Engagement, and she's joining us from Cleveland. Hi, Crystal. We're excited to have a special guest with us today, Chad Lord, who's speaking with us from Washington, D.C. Chad is the Policy Director for the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition. The coalition is a group that brings together over 160 member organizations and working with them to amplify the region's clean water priorities in Washington. And we'll hear a lot more from Chad about the coalition in a bit. For our agenda today, we'll start things off with Molly, and Molly will give us a quick overview of our top federal Great Lakes policy priorities for this year. We'll then have a discussion amongst our panel, and then we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. So Molly, I'll turn it over to you to get started.
Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here, and let's get this party started. I want to begin by wishing you all a happy Black History Month. We rolled out our federal priorities for the Biden administration and Congress the day after the inauguration, and we're excited to talk to you about them today. This year is special because we have a new president and a new Congress. That means we have lots of opportunities to educate people about our priorities and convince them to make them their priorities. And that's exactly what we plan to do with your help. Before I get into the substance of our 2021 federal priorities, I'll note that they are the same for both the Biden administration and for Congress, because the specific actions that we're recommending are different. And here's why. The president and administrative agencies like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency can set and act on their own policies within the limits of the law. For example, EPA can use its existing authority under the Clean Water Act to do more to stop pollution from farms, or increase the number of enforcement actions it takes against polluters. Similarly, EPA can use policy to change how it determines what communities can afford when they want to do infrastructure projects, which has a huge impact on timelines, water outcomes, and water affordability. And President Biden has already taken a number of actions through executive orders. Meanwhile, Congress can pass new laws and holds the purse strings for funding agencies and programs. The Alliance has developed 5 priority areas for our federal policy work. I'm going to go through each of them briefly and give an example of what this could look like and what we're advocating for. If you've already checked out our federal priorities on our website, you may have noticed that climate change is not a standalone priority. Climate change is an umbrella issue, and we are weaving the need to be climate adaptive into all of our priorities. We recognize that climate change makes many of our problems worse. I'm about to talk about, We'll be talking to members of Congress and the administration about how climate change impacts the Great Lakes. And with that, I'm finally going to actually talk about our priorities. Number one, first priority, environmental justice. Low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately impacted by pollution. Environmental justice seeks to address this unfair distribution of pollution and repair the harm that is caused and continues to be caused. It requires the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of color and low-income communities in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. The Great Lakes region has an opportunity to help lead the way. There are specific actions the federal government can take to address environmental justice in the Great Lakes region right now. For example, Congress and the President could update the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to intentionally use funding to address pollution and resource access challenges in environmental justice communities. Number two, our second priority is water infrastructure. Clean water is a basic need, and no one should be without clean, safe, and affordable water in their home. No one should have to worry about sewage backing up into their basement or community flooding that damages property. Yet communities across the Great Lakes region continue to grapple with crumbling, antiquated drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. The longer we wait, the harder and more expensive these problems will be to solve. The 8 Great Lakes states need a combined $188 billion over the next 20 years for improvements, upgrades, and repairs to this infrastructure. Paying for water infrastructure projects is really expensive, yet the costs to fix them are often not shared equitably, which underscores the importance of financial support from the federal government. Clean water and water infrastructure are even more critical in the midst of the COVID-19 public health crisis. Investing in clean water infrastructure is a win-win, creating jobs and protecting public health. Congress should pass an infrastructure package that invests more than $100 billion, that's $100 billion, over the next 5 years to address failing drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. Priority number 3, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and agency support. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative provides funding for on-the-ground restoration projects in each of the Great Lakes states, from wetland restoration to cleaning up toxic hotspots. In addition to improving the Great Lakes ecosystem, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative results in more than a 3-to-1 return in additional economic benefits across the region. Congress should invest at least $375 million in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in FY 2022. That would be consistent with the recently reauthorized Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Authorization Act. However, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative on its own is not enough to protect and restore the Great Lakes and the communities that depend upon them. The Great Lakes also needs strong agencies to implement and enforce environmental laws. For example, the President and Congress could commit to returning to 2016 levels of basic monitoring and enforcement at US EPA, which requires commitment to restoring staff numbers and expertise, and that requires more funding for the agency. Priority number 4, stop invasive species. Invasive Asian carp pose a clear threat to the Great Lakes. Established populations of these fish are only 50 miles from Chicago and Lake Michigan, but it's not too late to prevent them from reaching the lakes. To keep these fish out of the Great Lakes, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has proposed the construction of a series of additional protective measures at Brandon Road Lock and Dam, which is located near Joliet, Illinois. After years of study and public debate, this project has been identified as the best step in stopping the fish from entering the Great Lakes and allowing waterborne commerce to continue moving through the lock. The project has wide bipartisan support and it's authorized by Congress. And the next phase of the project pre-construction engineering and design, is finally starting this year. President Biden should include funding for this design work in his first budget proposal expected in March. And then Congress should provide full funding to the Army Corps of Engineers in FY22 so that the second year of work can continue without interruption. And finally, last but certainly not least, priority number 5, reducing agricultural pollution. Nutrient pollution that fuels harmful algal blooms is a significant threat to the region's drinking water, quality of life, and economic well-being. Runoff from agricultural lands is a significant contributor to the phosphorus pollution that drives these blooms. Farm Bill conservation programs are critical to addressing water quality problems caused by agriculture. But these voluntary programs are not enough to prevent this pollution. Farm Bill conservation programs should link funding with accountability to ensure that they are achieving clean water goals. The administration should direct all federal agencies to use their funding, planning, and regulatory authorities and work together to help achieve pollution reduction commitments in the western basin of Lake Erie. The goal is a 40% reduction in phosphorus in the western Lake Erie Basin by 2025, and we're not on target to meet it. It's going to take all the federal agencies and states working together to achieve that goal. So those are our priorities for this year, and we're super excited about them. And we hope that you will join us in advocating for them with your members of Congress. And now I'm going to hand things back over to Jen to explain what's next.
Thanks, Molly. Okay, so I have some questions. Uh-oh, I've lost the video. There you are. I lost the video feed. I think I still see all of you. Okay, apparently I can't look at you and have the slides up at the same time, so we'll just have to wing it. Hi, everyone. We are going to have a panel conversation with, actually, just hold on a second here. I'm just going to, okay. I think we still have you on camera. So I'll just pretend that you're there. I can't actually see you, Joel, Chad, Molly, and Crystal. So if you want to chime in, you're just going to have to wave at me. Technology in the pandemic era. So thanks, Molly, for that overview. My first question, I'm going to start with Joel and Chad. And I just want to dig in a little bit into how the Alliance's policy team developed this list of priorities and how these priorities complement other groups' policy priorities. And Chad, hopefully you can talk a little bit about the HOW Coalition, the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition. But Joel, I'll start off with you to tell us a little bit about how we came up with this list of priorities.
Sure thing, Jen. And hi, everybody. I think that, first and foremost, it's about Great Lakes priorities that have the biggest impact on the Great Lakes themselves and on the people who live near them and rely on them. And I think it's important when we develop this list, we step back and think about what's this phenomenal diversity of ways that people across the Great Lakes region experience the Great Lakes. Some of those are positive experiences, some of those are negative. And the health of the Great Lakes is really firmly linked to the people who live near them having those experiences and who depend on them for drinking water, for livelihood, for recreation and play. And so we work to have a list of priorities that reflects all or as many of those experiences as we can, and growing our region's strength from where it is, which is already really strong, to protect the lakes really depends on reflecting these connections and communities across the Great Lakes region. I also want to pick up on something that Molly mentioned or alluded to, which is that these are really customized for the authorities that the Congress has and that the administration has. Of course, there's lots of work that is also needs to happen at the state and local level in the Great Lakes region, but these are really focused on those federal authorities. And yeah, I'd love to hear from Chad about the work of the Healing Our Waters Coalition, which is a real valued and important partner in the Great Lakes region and certainly to the Alliance.
Yeah, thank you, Joel, and welcome. I'm so pleased to join you today from Washington, D.C. Just so you all know, we have a little bit of Great Lakes weather here today. It is starting to snow, so thank you all for bringing that little winter to us on the East Coast. Yeah, the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition came together about 15 years ago, and it really was designed to try and amplify the voices of folks in the region here in Washington, D.C. to really succeed in achieving the goals that organizations like the Alliance and other members have to really for clean water resources in the region. And we really do rely on the leadership of the Alliance and all of our members to share what those priorities are, like the ones that are being talked about today, and how we can use the coalition's resources, the coalition's network, to really amplify that agenda here in Washington. We have a number of events and other activities that we use to bring those voices to DC decision makers, whether or not that is the U.S. Congress or the U.S. or the administration, and we really do try to listen carefully. And so, the coalition's agenda this year is very similar to what the Alliance's agenda. So, prioritizing safe, affordable access to water during the COVID crisis, advancing restoration protection through the GLRI, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, ensuring that those resources are being prioritized for environmental justice communities, supporting efforts to address the water infrastructure crisis to ensure that everyone has access to safe, affordable, clean water, and restoring and strengthening clean water protection. So that's the agenda the coalition will be talking to members about, and it's very similar to what Molly outlined today.
Thanks, Joel and Chad. Chad, I'm going to stick with you for a minute because you're sort of on the ground, sometimes our eyes and ears there in Washington, and I know you spend a lot of time in normal times meeting with members of Congress, agency officials, and all those things. I'm sure that's all probably happening by Zoom these days. But, from us all the way over here in the Midwest, we see a deeply divided Congress. We know that there's a super politicized, polarized environment in Washington. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. Do you think it's realistic that we can get anything done in Washington? Can we advance a Great Lakes agenda in this challenging political climate? And what are you hearing, and what do you expect to see in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, sure. I do think it's realistic because we've done it. All we have to look at is last year and the accomplishments that this region made in advancing Great Lakes priorities through the last Congress. For example, Molly noted that Congress passed and the president signed into law the reauthorization for another 5 years of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, in boosting funding over the next 5 years to get us to that target of $475 million. And those resources are critical to advancing the restoration and protection of the Great Lakes for everyone in the region. And that happened last year on a bipartisan basis. Also, what happened last year is Congress came together and they supported the Brennan Road Lock and Dam project that Molly was talking about, again, through the leadership of the Alliance and others. We were able to convince Congress to authorize the construction of that project, but not only authorize it, but make it more affordable for the region. I think we have a little bit more work to do there, but it's moving in the right direction. And we saw a number of other bills also at least be introduced and considered around water infrastructure. And while they may not necessarily have gotten through over the finish line, we saw some advancement and some real deep dialogue around moving those things. And that all is a reflection of what I think we can expect this year. There is strong support we hear for water infrastructure as part of infrastructure legislation. We hear that from the Speaker of the House down through committee chairs. And so I think there is some reason to be optimistic. We see a real strong focus on climate and climate resiliency throughout all of the programs. And I think that is also an opportunity for us, for the region. Environmental justice, we have a president and many members of Congress who are prioritizing the fact that communities throughout the region have been disproportionately impacted by pollution. And it's time that we really focus on Black communities, Latino communities, low-income communities, rural communities, to make sure that they are benefiting from these investments. I think there is room for us to be successful there as well. Will it be easy? It may not be, but I do think there's a lot of motivation and a lot of energy and a lot of support for moving forward. And we have the bipartisan coalition in Congress to try and move these priorities forward.
Thanks, Chad. You're making me feel hopeful. That's good. You know, I have a question. I guess I'm going to come back to you, Joel, and Chad, you may also have thoughts on this. You know, President Biden has now been in office for 3-ish weeks, I think, not quite a month. And we've seen this flurry of activity, which, you know, happens with a new president, but I feel like I don't know, maybe it seems like a lot this year. He signed a whole ton of executive orders. He's obviously nominated his cabinet, and his cabinet officials are working their way through the Senate confirmation process. But that all feels a little abstract sometimes. What does all that mean for the Great Lakes? Does it help? Is it helpful at all?
Well, you know, one thing it's important to note is that I think it's clear that the vision for our federal environmental policy is you know, significantly different under this administration than the previous. And I know that there are and I think a lot of the folks on this webinar are paying attention. There's a long list of areas that this administration is seeking to address differently, and I think in a more protective and constructive way than the last administration. So it is hard to know like what is actually happening that's going to be, you know, good for the Great Lakes right now. I mean, I'll start just by talking about people and noting that, and Crystal, you shared this with me, so I'm going to read this quote from incoming administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Michael Regan. "We will be driven by our conviction that every person has the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthier life, no matter how much money they have in their pocket, the color of their skin, or what community they live in." And I mean, that's just a phenomenal foundation from which to start for the work of the Environmental Protection Agency. I think that sets the tone for the administration's attitude toward environmental protection generally as well. I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by the, you know, having a cabinet that in its diversity, I think really, you know, is reflective, is much more reflective of what the country looks like, which is encouraging. And I think that, you know, one last thing I'll mention is that, you know, incoming Administrator Regan has had his Senate confirmation hearing at the committee level last week, and 4 out of the 10 Republican members of that committee voted for him. And so what I see there is a support on a bipartisan basis for the person who's leading, frankly, you know, an agency, an environmental agency that can be controversial. I think that bodes really well for opportunities for bipartisan work on the Great Lakes. So we'll see.
And I would just add, you know, what that quote that Joel read, I think by Michael Regan, I think was that attitude was set from the very top. I mean, I think President Biden, through the executive orders that he did on his first day and then throughout that first week, really do set an agenda that I think, you know, that the president has been talking about. So, you know, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, and really trying to focus on, you know, the climate crisis, building equity and racial justice into, you know, all government operations through not only through an executive order on climate, but also one specifically rooted in an executive order rooted in equity and racial justice. And then the focus on infrastructure. You know, they have been talking about, the president has been talking about this Build Back Better campaign, and I think part of that has been trying to make sure that water is affordable. So I think you are seeing not only, you know, them walking the walk in terms of, and it's been a lot of activity, although some of that will still need to be fleshed out in detail. But I think there's reason to be optimistic.
Jen, I'll add, from a community perspective, I think it's really good to see the leadership from the top down put emphasis on environmental justice. Again, from a community perspective, we know that at the state and local levels, they're really reliant on federal funds. And so hearing that there is leadership that cares about these issues and that there may be guidance attached to federal funding with the prioritization on environmental justice, that will hopefully bode well at the local and state levels as well.
Thanks. So digging in, I'm going to ask a couple questions here to dig into some of the specific policy priorities that Molly mentioned earlier. And I'm going to start off, and we've been heading in this direction, talking a little bit about environmental justice. And so I'm going to talk about that, ask about that one first for you, Crystal, and you, Molly. And I've had this question from a number of our supporters and other people as we've rolled out this policy agenda, asking why did we list environmental justice as priority number one, both for the Biden administration and for Congress? And what does that kind of more specifically mean for the Great Lakes? Crystal, you were just touching on this a little bit, so I'm going to start with you on that question.
Sure. I think the first question is why not? Why not? This is a reflection of the listening that we've done across the Great Lakes. And so we've listened to communities. We've talked extensively about our report where step one was shut up and listen. We've heard folks, and it's the next step after listening to folks is actually responding with action. And so we've responded to what we've heard and incorporated what we've heard into our suite of priorities. And so now environmental justice is near and dear to our hearts. It's a prominent issue for both urban and rural communities alike. And so we see water as a unifier across the aisle, across the State House, City Council, and the federal government. And so it's an issue that we're hoping to dig in. We also realize that we have to appeal to the diverse group of people across the Great Lakes, from folks who are boaters and folks who depend on the Great Lakes for their livelihood, but then also the folks whose only connection to the lakes is that it's their source for tap water. And so with those folks, we heard that water affordability was an issue and that there were other environmental challenges and injustices that were happening. And that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and if I could speak to that, I'd like to start by echoing Crystal. Why not? That's perfect. Full stop. Listen, we can't separate the health of the Great Lakes from the people who live here. And unfortunately, many mainstream environmental organizations, like the Alliance for the Great Lakes, have been slow to make this connection. So we've got some ground to make up. The Great Lakes aren't healthy until everyone in the region has access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water and sewage service. It's critical that we prioritize issues that are most important and have the biggest impact on people and communities across the region. And because of some of Crystal's great work in terms of listening to communities and asking them what those highest priorities are, that's how we've landed here. So thanks, Crystal, for your leadership.
So I'm going to put in a plug. I have two more questions for our panel, so we will get to questions from the audience quickly, but I'm seeing some questions trickle in. Definitely chime in. You can, if you're in the audience, you can ask a question using the question box, and we'll definitely try to get to as many of the questions as we can. So like I said, I have two more questions for this panel. The first question, and maybe this is starting out for Chad and Crystal, you might also have some thoughts. We've heard a lot over the years about the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The GLRI is one of the biggest sort of federal funding programs for Great Lakes restoration and protection. And so, Chad, could you tell us just a little bit for those who might not know what the GLRI is, and what's the latest? I know that there was talk of President Trump trying to cut the funding, Congress put it back. Where do things stand now? And is it enough? Do we need more?
Yeah, so the good news is that it is still funding a lot of activity in the region to address harm that is decades old. So I think folks need to just remember that we've started a long way from the start line as it relates to the environmental harm that the lakes had received over decades of use. And so, but we are making progress. And so that's the good news side of the story, is that over the last 10 years, and the investments through the GLRI, we definitely are seeing results in the lakes coming back to life and being more resilient to the changes that our warming climate is having in the region. It's been reauthorized, like I said, for another 5 years. And so that's really good news. Not only has it been reauthorized, but that authorization level increases funding for the program over those 5 years. And I think that is a direct, and I think that directly represents the understanding of Congress that there is a tremendous amount of need still left in the region for us to address our restoration and protection priorities. And so, no, what we're receiving right now is not enough in order for us to be fully inclusive in how our restoration is impacting people across the basin. Through continued support, hopefully by President Biden in his first budget, but also the ongoing bipartisan support from Congress, we hope to see those resources increase so we are able to address those climate impacts, but also make sure that those restoration benefits are equitable and reaching Black communities, Latino communities, rural communities that have received the disproportionate brunt of pollution in the region.
Yeah, I'll add that GLRI is a successful program that's absolutely worthy of increased investment, for sure. But like many programs that were created long ago, could benefit from an equity and justice lens that ensures that funding is going to underserved communities. And so I think we could create an extensive list of programs throughout the government that could really benefit from a lens of trying to make sure that we are serving our most underserved communities. And so GLRI is one of those programs as well.
Thanks, Crystal. My last question is actually for Molly, and you touched briefly on the Asian carp issue, and I know that's something that a lot of people on the line have questions about. Tell us just really quickly, for those who don't know, a little, again, a refresher on what Asian carp are and where efforts stand, and what we stand to stop Asian carp, and what you expect to see from the Biden administration and Congress in the next year or so.
Sure. So Asian carp are those flying fish that you see in the YouTube videos, smacking into people. It's terrifying. It looks funny, but it's terrifying if you actually experience it. And then also fish that eat the bottom of the food web. And so they eat the food that other fish depend on, and that has an impact sort of up the food chain. And so we think that would have a pretty significant impact on the $7 billion a year fishing industry in the Great Lakes, and also on the $16 billion a year recreational boating industry in the Great Lakes. So thanks to, I'm sure, many of you who have heard a lot of carping from me to contact Governor Pritzker, your members of Congress, the Army Corps of Engineers, on and on and on, everyone, asking them to take the next step on Brandon Road. We've recently had a momentous step forward. So thank you all for that. We were able to get all of the agreements and funding in place to finally move to the next phase of the project, which is called pre-construction engineering and design. And it's where they do the bulk of the design work for the project, so that at the end of that phase, they're actually ready to enter into construction contracts and begin the work. So pretty big deal, pretty big win. Thanks to all of you who helped make it happen.
It's always good to start the year with start a new year with a win. That's great. So I see lots of questions pouring in. Thank you, everybody on the line, for asking questions. Again, you can use the question box to submit a question, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. So the first question, actually, Chad, I'm going to send to you, which I think is a really, this is a good point. And the person is asking basically along a recognition that Congress is made up of people from all 50 states, not just Great Lakes states. And so the question is along the lines of how non-Great Lakes states, are they supportive of Great Lakes policy? Are they supportive of like programs like the GLRI? How does that interplay work, and what do you hear from non-Great Lakes states, and how do you make that case for Great Lakes restoration? Because we need a lot of members of Congress to support these issues.
Yeah, that's a very good question. the region has spent quite a bit of time building power in its congressional delegation, and that delegation has a strong affinity for the Great Lakes, and they are willing to spend some capital to protect them. And that alone, I think, is recognized by members from around the country. People understand that you do not mess with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative because it has very powerful backing by really influential members of Congress who are, who hold seats of power. So I think we have to be grateful for the folks that have stepped forward and are willing to do the work, the legislative work, the sausage making, in order to be able to build. Not only do we have to build a coalition of folks in the region to bring and amplify the clean water voice in Washington, we also need that coalition to be in Washington to be able to act on those. And I think we have been able to do that for the most part on many of the priorities that we're talking about today. We don't need to have folks in California to be champions of the Great Lakes. We need people in California to understand that the Great Lakes members are champions of the Great Lakes and that they will be calling on them to support Great Lakes as an issue.
Thanks. The next question I have is another good one. And the question asker says, references the $188 billion figure, which I think is in reference to that huge backlog of infrastructure funding for fixing our drinking water pipes, our wastewater, stopping combined sewer overflows. And so the question is, how much of that is already funded? And asking if the GLRI any of that money goes to that, or does it go somewhere else? So where does that money come from? And could somebody talk a little bit more about how funding works for infrastructure, water infrastructure now, and how we might reach that backlog? Joel, do you want to take that one?
I'll start, and I'm sure others have more than I have to say. But I'll to put it simply, the federal government does not provide a lot of grant money for the construction of water infrastructure. Most of those funds are provided in the forms of low interest loans, or they're paid for by state and local funding. And ultimately, especially over the last 30 or 40 years, it's the ratepayer, you, the individual, who will eventually pay for the cost of that infrastructure out of your pocket as part of the rates that you pay a local utility. And so one of the things that we're advocating for is to really acknowledge the fact that there is a huge infrastructure liability in the Great Lakes region and across the country, but we do have some of the oldest drinking water and wastewater infrastructure here in the Great Lakes region in the country. And we're asking for an increase now, again, in the amount of money that actually comes in the form of grants, that actually is absolutely vital to supporting the hundreds of communities that will never be able to pay for the cost of renewing this infrastructure, which in many cases is 50 or more years old, on their own. And so we're one of the pivots we're looking for is one from where the vast majority of the funding is in the form of loans, to one that really reckons with the fact that we have to renew the nation's infrastructure across the board, and that's going to require federal support. Chad, I know you think about this a lot too, so I'm going to pitch things over to you.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I would note that that $188 billion figure is probably conservative. It's probably a lot higher. But that is, I think, the best estimates that folks have coming out of the US EPA. Yeah, absolutely. Joel, you're absolutely correct. I would note not only do we have to fix our gray infrastructure, but we also have to, invest in our green infrastructure to really deal with creating more climate resilient communities and all the benefits that come from recreating nature in our neighborhoods. And the GLRI does fund some of that green infrastructure activity. The GLRI itself does not fund the pipes. Those are other programs out of the US EPA and other agencies. Those programs are the ones responsible for funding that. But the GLRI does play a role because it really does kind of invest in some of that greener infrastructure side of things. But absolutely, if we're going to deal with affordability, we got to get more money into communities so they don't have to shift those costs down onto the ratepayer.
And I'll just say there's a good precedent for this in the GLRI itself. The GLRI is federal funding supporting the restoration of the Great Lakes because the Great Lakes have given a lot to this country. And I think there's a similar rationale for recognizing that the future vitality of our region really depends on, in some ways, the water infrastructure that we can't see, but we are utterly dependent on. So I think that argument is going to hold water, if you'll pardon the pun, in Washington.
Shifting course a little bit, we have a question asking about the federal government's relationship with Canada, right? The Great Lakes are a binational waterway. And so we know we rely a lot on coordination and cooperation with Canada to protect those waters. And so the question is, do we anticipate the federal government's relationship with Canada to change under the Biden administration? And what does that mean for Great Lakes restoration overall and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative? So Chad, maybe I'll have you tackle that one first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a binational resource. I mean, there is an international boundary that goes through 4 of the lakes. And so it has to be managed by both the Canadians and the United States. I think there is a lot of optimism north of the border that they have a more welcome administration to address things like climate change and other restoration of this shared resource. The Canadians will have to do their own process in terms of how much they will fund, but I do think there is opportunity. I mean, I also will point that we have the revised Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that also needs to be implemented and is a resource for folks on both sides of the border to hold their federal governments accountable.
And Jen, you reminded me that President Biden's first phone call to an international leader was to Prime Minister Trudeau. And so I think, that personal relationship could really help in terms of how our countries are working together to protect and restore the Great Lakes.
I have a question. Our question asker is in the Green Bay area and works for a water utility up there. And the question I think is a good one. And it's asking about, how we partner with water utilities, if we do, and what water utilities can be doing to support a lot of these priorities and sort of this focus of the alliances. And so, Crystal, maybe I'll pitch that one to you because I know you do a lot of work with water utilities, particularly in Ohio, but around the region.
For sure. Yeah, I know that some of our priorities, especially in terms of affordability, resonate with local water utilities. Whereas then the split is where we talk about no more water shutoffs, and then the conversations change a little bit. But we also say that in that same vein, when we are calling on no more water shutoffs for residential water customers due to non-payment, we're also asking that the federal and state governments increase investment to local water utilities because we understand that they're running a business. And so we think that there are some things that local municipal water utilities could do to help alleviate that burden on low-income residents. I know that there are utilities that have internal water affordability task forces to talk about what policies they can implement internally. They have community education sessions where they go out and talk about the customer assistance programs that they are offering. They have transparency processes where they talk about water rate setting. We are doing a study in partnership other environmental organizations to study water rate setting processes. Just being open with us so that we can go in and get that information and share best practices across the region is super helpful so that we can really provide that service to the utilities. And so those are some of the things that I think would be helpful to the movement, environmental organizations, but also helpful to the community as they seek to try to figure out how to alleviate that burden on a day-to-day, especially during this pandemic. We are finding more and more folks that are on that line between just barely being able to pay their bills, and a little bit of assistance, a little bit of patience, a little bit of grace and a little bit of education about what programs are available goes really a long way right now.
Yeah, just to add on to that, and another way that, of course, water utilities is on the wastewater side and the stormwater side also, put water, back into the Great Lakes and our rivers and lakes inland that has lots of sometimes pollution in it, and some of that is, it's obviously highly regulated, but some of that are things like phosphorus that are, the same kinds of nutrients that come off of farm fields. Some wastewater utilities across the region have been leaders in really being aggressive about reducing the amount of phosphorus that's going into their local waters, and that leadership really speaks loudly when we're talking about these big challenges like cleaning up Lake Erie or cleaning up Green Bay from phosphorus. And so utilities can also, show leadership by communicating about the controls that they've put in place to make sure that their local waters are being cleaned up. And that's been really helpful, I know, in Wisconsin and in other parts of the Great Lakes region.
I have a comment here, which I think is a really important one. And the commenter points out that we haven't mentioned Indigenous or Native American communities at all. And I think that's a really important point for us to make. And certainly our Native American communities around the Great Lakes region have been really important partners in the Great Lakes restoration movement, but have also suffered some of the environmental injustices. And Joel, wonder if you could talk about our partnership in the Green Bay watershed with I believe it's the Oneida Nation up there. And they're really important partners in some of the work to reduce the pollution flowing into Green Bay that causes algal blooms and other problems. So could you talk a little bit about that partnership?
Yeah, I certainly can. Thanks to the person who raised that. It's a critical recognition of the fact that there are Native nations that were here before I was and before any of us on this call were using and stewarding this land, and that we are all here today in the footsteps of that. We are just a couple of ways that I know the Alliance is engaging with tribal communities across the Great Lakes region. As Jen mentioned, we have a longstanding partnership with the Oneida Nation in Northeast Wisconsin, working on phosphorus reduction from agriculture, which is the big challenge that causes harmful algal blooms in dead zones in Green Bay. I'll go so far as to say that the leadership of the Oneida Nation and its willingness to join local collaborations with other government officials and the Alliance has been just frankly fundamental to our ability to make progress there. And I really appreciate their commitment to that work there. We've also been, one of the other ways I've seen the need for real advocacy for the role of tribal nations in Great Lakes protections has been through the implementation of the Great Lakes Water Resources Compact, which is not something, that's the policies that guide the stop water from the Great Lakes region. And I know we have worked to be an advocate in support of the effort to ensure that tribal nations have a voice of authority at the decision-making table in those processes as well. And so thanks for bringing that up. And it's important that we continue to commit to finding ways to advocate for Indigenous peoples' priorities for the Great Lakes across the region.
Thanks, Joel. Crystal, I'm going to direct the next question to you. The question is asking if there's been any progress in reducing the agricultural runoff that flows into the Western Lake Erie Basin and causes those terrible, harmful algal blooms. And I know you're working a lot on that issue in Ohio, and you were recently appointed to the, I think I'm going to get this right, the Ohio Lake Erie Commission. Did I get that right? And so what's the status of efforts there to prevent those harmful algal blooms?
I think there have been lots of efforts. We are encouraged by the efforts that are happening with, especially with the H2 Ohio program, the $172 million investment made on Lake Erie by Governor DeWine. However, we're not seeing the progress needed to meet the phosphorus reduction goals that have been outlined for Lake Erie. And so we know that we need to ramp up efforts and then really get specific about what success or what the each effort will look like in terms of success. Right now we have lots of efforts and we're not quite sure how they're impacting the overall goals. And so we know that there's not going to be a silver bullet. It's going to be a myriad of things that come together to help us to reach the goal. But we're not seeing the success that we need and the progress that we need to reach the goal right now. Yeah.
And I just want to emphasize that's one of the areas where we really, and Molly mentioned this in her comments, there really is a need for a more intense coordinated federal action. There are a number of authorities that our federal agencies have that the Biden administration can put to work on this in a more coordinated and aggressive way. And so we'll be continuing to make that point to follow through on what the challenges that Crystal talked about.
Yeah, and I think just to put a bow on it, we also need some accountability. I think we've had lots of investment in Lake Erie and lots of effort, and now we need to make sure that taxpayers are seeing accountability in the form of clean water outcomes for the tax dollars being expended in this area. And so that is a focus for our organization.
I have a question here asking about coastal resiliency and asking if that's included in any of these priorities. And I know we mentioned overall that climate change is kind of a theme throughout all of these policy priorities. And Joel, I don't know if you could talk just briefly about coastal resiliency and opportunities at the federal level. I know there are some studies or things that are being assessed by Congress especially to help communities deal with the very high and very low water levels, which is all related to climate change. So could you comment on that, Joel?
Sure. Yeah, and it's in the details, and there's a longer, more detailed version of our priorities on the website that you can check out. But one of the items, I think this might be what the person is referring to, is there is a authorized Great Lakes coastal resiliency study, which would allow the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that takes on these big engineering projects to actually look at the entire Great Lakes and evaluate where there are needs and opportunities for doing larger scale coastal resiliency and restoration. And that's the kind of effort that's really needed to understand where some significant federal dollars could eventually get put to work for addressing the reality of high and low water levels, which, in this unpredictability, which is going to be with us now permanently or for the foreseeable future. I know that does not address the need to protect an individual piece of land today or this summer, which I know is an urgent challenge that some communities and some landowners have, but it's really important that we get a full picture and a really high quality analysis so we can talk about the next generation of investment in coastal resilience. I think that's got to be a top priority. And we've demonstrated, as Chad said, that we've got the ability as a region to advocate for funding. What we don't have is a clear plan for what a resilient, restored Great Lakes shoreline that really benefits everybody in the region could look like. And so I think that the questioner is right on in asking about that. And I hope that the Biden administration funds and directs that study to get done as soon as possible in this first year of the administration.
Thanks, Joel. I'm going to start to wrap it up here with one last question, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer it. I have a couple of different questions asking about where do I even start? How do I get involved? What is maybe the one thing that I could do to help or to get involved with in my local community to help the Great Lakes and push these priorities forward? I will share with everyone, we do have an action alert on our website. I'll share the link for that in a minute, that where you can write President Biden and your members of Congress. But for our panelists, I'd love to hear from you, like what your suggestion would be to people looking to get involved and help either locally or elsewhere. So Joel, I'll start with you.
Okay, well, I'll say something. You know, of course, you're all here, so you're all paying attention to the Alliance, and I really appreciate that. You probably have, if you're talking locally, you probably have a local organization in your neck of the woods that may even be a member of the Alliance or the Healing Our Waters Coalition already. And there are always opportunities to get involved at that very local level. So I do encourage you to seek those out and find a water group that's active in your community and is looking for, will always be looking for support. And that's a great way to get to know how these big priorities connect to what's going on the ground where you live.
Thanks, Joel. Chad, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, from the coalition, we're a coalition of organizations, and so I would just encourage you all to become members of the Alliance. I would of other organizations in your community. Volunteer your time if you have the resources. Volunteer your money to really support these local groups who are doing this work, and hopefully they are members of the Healing Our Waters Coalition, and we can lift up and amplify those voices in Washington.
Crystal?
I'd say go to the groups that you know that are super active in your community, that you respect their work and have a precedence for creating impact. And then talk to them about environmental issues and where they get their information as well. And don't hesitate to reach out to the Alliance and use us as a resource as well.
And Molly, I'll give you the last word on this one.
Yeah, I think find out who your elected officials are at the local level, at the state level, at the congressional level, and call them. Call them often and let them know about the things that you care about, the things that you want them to do for your community, for your state, for the Great Lakes. Chad and I have been in those offices when those phone calls are coming in and staff aides are taking notes. And when they get a lot of calls on a particular issue, you know, that gets elevated. And so find out who your local, state, congressional electeds are and give them a call.
Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to share my screen again and show you all some additional opportunities to get involved. As I mentioned, we have an action alert on our website, greatlakes.org/takeaction, and we make it super easy for you to write a letter to President Biden and to Congress and urge them to support and fund the policy agenda we've talked about today. If you want to dig in and you want to really read a whole lot about our top 5 policy priorities, you can find that all on our website, greatlakes.org/news, as where all that information is found. And also, don't forget to join us next Thursday, February 18th, for a really interesting webinar conversation with Crystal Davis and a few other guests digging into the environmental justice issues that we talked about today. So we will send all of those links, a copy of the recording to everybody on this webinar later this afternoon. And special thank you to our panelists, Chad, Joel, Molly, and Crystal, for taking your time today to talk to us about all these issues. We appreciate it so much. And with that, thank you all again and have a really wonderful day. Bye, everybody.